good afternoon and welcome everyone to this point of care panel discussion at this virtual conference. My name is Strohmenger, and I will be co-chairing this panel together with Silvio Belletti, and we'll now start with the first round of introductions. So my personal background is medicine economics, and I'm a managing partner at a Munich-based venture capital fund called Wellington Partners. We've been around for more than 20 years, doing deals in the healthcare space, in biotechnology, medical devices, diagnostics, and healthcare IT companies. We're currently investing out of a 210 million euros pan-European fund. And I'm also glad to be an investor in SphingoTec, which is represented by Achim Plum, who will tell you more about that, and also on the board of that company. And in the past, I've been involved in a couple of diagnostics companies before, including MTM Laboratories that we exited to Roche very successfully, or Definiens, which was acquired by AstraZeneca. Now I hand over to Silvio.
Thank you, Rainer. So my name is Silvio Belletti. I'm a managing director and partner of the Boston Consulting Group. I'm a core member of the healthcare practice. I serve clients both in the biopharma and in the medtech spaces, both corporate clients as well as private equity funds. My specialty is around new product launches, commercial strategies, commercial model, top line growth in general. And I'm really happy to be co-chairing this interesting panel. I guess we can start the introduction of our panelists. So Martin, do you want to go first?
Sure. So my name is Martin Potkitter. I'm VP of Corporate Business Development at QIAGEN. So basically what we are doing is looking into technologies, and depending on if they are interesting for us, we have different tools like distribution partnerships, licensing, venturing, so corporate investments, or M&A. My focus is a bit more on diagnostics, and I'm in the company now since 20 years.
Thank you. Christoph, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, Silvio. My name is Christoph Pedain. I work for Siemens Healthineers, and at Siemens Healthineers, I'm the head of point of care diagnostics, and that's a sub-company based out of Boston, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Christoph. Achim, you want to go next?
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, so my name is Achim Plum. I'm one of the managing directors and the chief commercial officer of SphingoTec, so responsible for all commercial operations and in particular introduction of our novel diagnostic tests into the market. The company focuses entirely on new biomarkers and assays for those new biomarkers in critical care conditions, so life-threatening conditions where patients rapidly change their status, rapidly deteriorate, and we have developed several biomarkers that can help to predict these events, diagnose them, monitor them, and thereby help patient management in critical care. Personally, I have a background in life science, but I'm now in the industry, mostly on the commercial side for 20 years in companies like Epigenomics, Siemens actually, and the Curetis, so infectious disease space, cancer. But now I'm happy to be in this very exciting critical care area.
Thank you. Rainer Metzger.
Thank you, Silvio. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renate Vitzka, and I'm the managing director of the clinical trial business at Medicover. Medicover is a 20,000 plus people healthcare company, actually managing diagnostics and healthcare at the same time in core regions like Germany and the entire Central Eastern European part. Previously to Medicover, I've been working for QIAGEN in business development and the area of pharma and diagnostics. And so I did for a Danaher company called Blanca Biosystems and But before that, I have been working for more than 10 years for Roche Diagnostics and Roche Pharma in Basel. And actually, I have started my business running my own company for more than 7 years in Munich. So I look forward to the discussion, eager to discuss with you guys, and look forward to that.
Thank you. So I think the topic of our panel is quite broad, no? And maybe a good way to start tackling this broad topic is to ask Christoph, who is head of point of care at Siemens and has a nice vantage point in this respect, if he can help us characterize a little bit the market, the landscape of what really point of care testing means in the context of COVID-19, and what are the, let's say, existing and emerging use cases where you see an interesting business opportunity already today or even in the future coming up next.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Silvio. Yeah. So how did point of care actually help in the global response to the pandemic? And we may want to look at this maybe through two lenses. First lens, that's really about an individual, right? Caring for the critically ill, for example, in how we respond to the challenges that presented themselves and respiratory implications in the intensive care units. So, for example, we all heard about the shortages of ventilators at the onset of the pandemic, right? For patients under respiratory support, access to point of care blood gas testing is required. And physicians need that to properly manage the ventilation. Right? But point of care testing doesn't stop there. It's also helpful for risk stratification, for example, in finding comorbidities such as unrecognized diabetes or other implications like a septic shock. Right? And all that is point of care in the first lens, caring for the individual. And then we feel there is a second lens to that too, and that's rather a population lens. That would be more about helping to limit the spread of the disease, right? And what comes to mind here are rapid tests for antigens, antibodies, point of care molecular tests, right? And especially also on the antibody side, once the medical insight is generated, to see if people have built up antibodies that will help their individual response again against the virus and reduce the spread. That situation really, I feel, is a diagnostics moment, and both in critical care and in supporting the containment of the virus. And I believe it's a point of care diagnostics moment in particular, because point of care testing is fast. Oftentimes it's done in a way that it requires little to no instrumentation, and that it can be performed reliably by just a whole lot of people, and more people, lesser trained people than would be needed to operate lab equipment. Right? So at Siemens Healthineers, we really check all these boxes. We are very strong in laboratory. We're very strong in point of care diagnostics, and we are swiftly responding to the emerging needs, like so many others on this call and beyond do that right now.
Thanks, Christoph, for helping us frame the discussion and building on the way you have sliced this topic. Maybe I think we have an interesting question also for Martin. Martin, you work at QIAGEN, which has been very active since the beginning in the issue of identifying new patients. What are your perspectives on this in terms of key trends and challenges? And can you tell also something about what is your thought around the issue of assessing the severity of patients as well?
Yeah, Silvio, thanks. So basically, Christoph is right. Point of care is an important market specifically for life-threatening diseases. The angle that QIAGEN is looking into is, of course, in two ways. Like Siemens, we have the central lab business, so the higher throughput platforms. And of course, there's a need for volume-based testing of COVID-19 as an example. But there's a clear trend in decentralization in using point of care. And with that, of course, there's a kind of input of RNA analytic for more sensitivity and specificity compared to antigen-based So this is where we see a trend. Obviously, you cannot do everything at the same time. So the turnaround time, of course, is much faster than centralized testing. So you can go down to 1 hour. I think the wish, of course, in the market would be to have a super accurate RNA test within 15 to 20 minutes. And maybe we will come to that point, but that's more or less where you have to go. Another one aspect that is of importance, of course, is a clear differential diagnosis. And this is why we are looking into not only single assays on SARS-CoV. It's also a kind of syndromic testing where you can really differentiate within one test potential diseases, if it's now flu or a cold or really a COVID. So that's the second one. And of course, if you have identified patients that suffer from COVID, the main question really is, and we have seen that now in the last month quite heavily, are they tuning down to severe infection, including, of course, all kind of cytokine storm effects, or are they more or less in a kind of ambient condition and they just get released from the virus without critical symptoms over time? And this kind of, I think, risk prognosis of the severity is definitely of importance for us and in the future. And maybe we can talk about that a bit later, but this is an area where we are still missing clinical validated biomarkers. There are lots of approaches you can go for. One would be, of course, for the first phase, for the viral phase, just to look into the viral load at the time of the first diagnosis. And if you have a high viral load, this is an indication of a severe disease coming up. Yeah. And the other part, of course, if you're moving a bit later on and moving to the phase where the cytokine storm turns up, the question really is, what could be there a good biomarker early to really understand how this impacts the disease itself and how you can really treat it in a way that it makes a good balance between a positive effect of the drug and any kind of side effect.
That is, I think, a very interesting topic, and I think that ideally builds the bridge to ask now Achim to tell us a little bit more about the proprietary platform Nexus IB10 that you are using to bring the proprietary biomarkers of SphingoTec into the clinic and make them available in intensive care medicine, not only but also for better monitoring and treatment of COVID-19 patients. So Achim, maybe you can give us a little bit more details. What your strategy is.
Thank you, Rainer. Very good point. So indeed, I mean, we think a lot about, when we hear COVID, we think a lot about viral testing and on the population level, on the individual level. But I think point of care utility has a lot of advantages beyond that to help us in this very particular situation, especially when it comes to the severe cases of COVID. And there are two basically aspects to that. One is to better understand the stage of the disease, the prognosis, and and monitor the course of the disease. And that is important for managing the individual patient, but we also are faced with a very, actually for the developed world, quite new situation that we also are at over the limits, actually operating in some countries over the limits of the healthcare system in terms of what intensive care we can provide. And so the question of triage becomes incredibly important. But for triage, you need objective parameters to understand what status is my patient in, what is the prognosis, will this patient need organ support, and so on. And I think as these patients deteriorate very quickly, this is a prime area where point of care can deliver actionable information on a very short time frame for the patients and give doctors a chance to take more informed decisions. Now, certainly there are quite a number of standard parameters that are used in that context in COVID and have made it even to the daily press, like the use of D-dimer or to certain inflammatory markers like IL-6, CRP, that are broadly available. Also procalcitonin for excluding bacterial co-infections and things like that. We as SphingoTec were in a very interesting situation. So we had developed over the last years and validated extensively in conditions like sepsis, acute heart failure, and so on, biomarkers that actually help to identify what is actually the driving pathway that eventually, if not successfully, no successful intervention happens, leads to mortality in these critical care conditions. And so we have found markers that reflect endothelial function and can predict septic shock, for example. We have other markers that indicate cardiac depression, a totally different pathway, also can lead to shock and then organ failure and death, or a very specific kidney function marker, PenKit, that allows to very early on assess kidney functions. Now, we were in a very interesting situation when COVID reached Germany, that we were in some of these, with our tests, in some of these clinical centers that were faced with the first wave, including, for example, the University Hospital of Aachen. So we were able to generate very early data whether what we see with our biomarkers in terms of predictive power to predict the course of to establish a prognosis for the patient and predict organ failure in a very pathway-specific way, to do that on COVID patients. And it turns out that there are striking similarities. So we currently have initial evidence that these biomarkers can actually apply to the COVID-19 case to specifically predict organ failure. And now that is all nice, but it only makes sense if you can make them available in a convenient way. And here we are in the fortunate situation that we do have our own point of care platform, the Nexus IB10, that is actually a result of an acquisition from Samsung in 2018, that allows us to perform those tests on whole blood in 20 minutes. And we are now deploying these tests in centers that are struggling with the patient load. For example, one project we are doing currently in London is to help stratifying patients that are risk or that will have a need for renal replacement therapy, because the challenge here is that the resources for that may not be available at the site where the patient was initially brought in terms of with severe COVID. So to help to predict will this patient will need renal replacement therapy, and then make better use of the medical resources in the network, and probably still have a chance to transfer the patient to a site where renal replacement therapy can be made available, and the hospital is not yet operating beyond its limits. So these are just examples, certainly looking at our biomarker bioADM for shock, same situation. So predict early whether this patient needs intervention, whether this patient needs to be admitted to the intensive care unit, because the patient will likely face a shock situation. So that's the kind of applications we are looking at this moment.
And I think what is also very remarkable is that the identification of these biomarkers, that was done by the team around Andreas Bergmann, involved, for example, in the field of septic shock, more than 16,000 patients with septic shock. So validation is extremely good already. And this biomarker really seems to predict septic shock 1 to 2 days before it actually affects the patient. And so doctors can really gain a lot of time and can really bring the patient from the ward where the patient is treated to the intensive care unit or to a center that has an intensive care unit that is not too far away from the hospital where the patient is treated. And I think that is a major progress once this is everywhere available.
Yeah, absolutely, Rainer. I mean, that's the markers we are focusing on, and that's one of the key criteria in development, is that they basically reflect the disease condition in real time. Now, kind of going back to our topic here of the panel point of care, certainly that real-time information makes only sense and only buys the physician the time to take decisions, to treat, to change course, as you just pointed out, if the test result is also available instantaneously, basically. And that's why it isn't the combination of these biomarkers that reflect a real-time, kind of the status of the patient in real time from a pathological point of view. It can only be really used if also the test result becomes available in real time. And that's why we believe this combination, and that's also the feedback we're getting from the clinicians we're working with, that making those test results really available in a couple of minutes, so our tests typically take 20 minutes, is key to use that time advantage of the biomarker. So it's really the combination of that biomarker biology and the actual availability, short turnaround time, and also the random access aspect of the point of care testing. So you test the patient when it's needed. You don't collect batches. You don't have to wait for the lab to come back. So really providing this real-time feedback to the physician is incredibly important here.
So thank you, Rainer. Maybe you can comment on that from your experience. I mean, you are representing a large provider of lab services to hospitals, and you've been observing the point of care business for a long time. And maybe you can also comment on, what has been over the last years or decades the problem with point of care? Why is it not available everywhere yet and more widely used?
Yeah, thank you, Rainer. So, being more in the end user setting, we are more looking at first of all, centralized business. I mean, Martin was pointing that out when he made the link to decentralized setting. I mean, point of care is probably more to be found in the decentralized setting. And when we start more top down, so we run large routine labs where obviously economy of scale is of essence, and where pricing is of essence. So we actually start there. And as we are funneling down for those suspicious cases where we have also some, let's say, time limitations, we may try to reconfirm with point of care devices. So, I mean, looking at COVID-19, we use primarily the main providers in the field, so the big diagnostic companies who make available routine diagnostics, but we also use for the subsetting providers that are prominent in the point of care field. So we use that in our clinical centers. We use that, for example, also in a program with elderly homes, where we screen suspicious cases. We do make this available for screening of employees in dedicated companies. We do screening for airline passengers. And you can well imagine, I mean, especially at the airport, we all do experience that, probably less so these days, when we were trying to connect from one place to the other, that you may miss your flight. And then you may run in a situation as you're flying into a region where you require a test up front to confirm that you're negative for COVID-19. You may require to rescreen that person. So we have also, for example, labs available at the airport in Munich, where we make that service available. So for those cases, point of care is important and will be used and will be utilized. But otherwise, I mean, economy of scale, as I said, is the critical key. I think if we are looking at COVID-19, to come back on that topic being very prominent right now, I would say point of care will kick in rather more so as we are now looking at antigen tests going to come into the market. And I mean, we see the first ones to hit the market with Abbott and Roche, who have just recently announced that. We obviously will also very likely see that for immunity tests that are the next level going to come. I think there is a rich field of further development, specifically with that high need momentarily to screen suspicious cases fairly quickly in order to avoid that you have contagious people spreading the virus even further. So I think those are the area next to what Achim was saying. I mean, that's more linked to the intensive care unit. But I mean, for what bothers us today, I think that is the area it's going to come. So we as Medicover look intensively into this area as we believe there is room for growth and expansion.
Yeah, my personal impression is, if we talk about COVID-19, that this topic will remain a very important topic even after the availability of the first vaccines. And maybe, whoever wants to comment on that, what would you say are also the opportunities for diagnostics companies to position themselves? So to my understanding, one problem that we still have is how do we really measure if a patient really has developed an immunity against the disease?
Maybe I can comment on that real quick if you'd like me to, Rainer. So one of the diagnostics challenges that we see here really starts even before that, right? We can now quantitatively analyze a titer. So Siemens Healthineers was the first company to launch a laboratory diagnostics test that's actually quantitative. Now the medical community will do research and find out eventually what the titer is that also is associated with immune protection, right? But the second piece that we need to achieve as an industry is the standardization across the tests, across the platforms. So at Siemens, the colleagues from laboratory diagnostics have just entered into agreements with the Centers for Disease Control in the US, the equivalent body in Europe, to work on that standardization. That provides a platform of knowledge on which that immunity can be concluded from.
So is there already evidence about correlation of the titers with the prognosis of the disease?
There are publications, but we are still some ways away from actual evidence. That is likely going to be an outcome of the vaccine trials, right, that are currently running all over the globe.
Achim, where would you see opportunities in the diagnostic space, especially also for young companies, young innovative companies, you cannot compete with the Siemens or Roche or Abbott with respect to standard parameters and speed and price. And what is really the leverage for a young company?
I think this whole COVID-19 situation, first of all, on a almost societal level, highlighted the importance of diagnostics. So that's something that is in general helpful. Specifically now, we are in a specific situation. So you mentioned that we have extensive validation data on our biomarkers, but and so now we are at the stage where we bring those biomarkers in the actual application in the clinical routine. So we have launched the tests and so on. Now, COVID for us offers an opportunity in this particular high need situation where people really desperately look at objective information, especially in our case on the management of these severe cases, that there's a lot of openness to try these new biomarkers. And I think that is very helpful for us. There's a certain openness to innovation that we are experiencing at the moment to try things. And certainly we need to do that in a proper way, but it's not that we are coming with biomarkers that haven't seen lots of, very good validation studies and literally over 100 publications on those biomarkers. So, but now translating that into that specific use case, COVID-19, there's a lot of openness to try things because, frankly, physicians, be it in this triage question, so who needs my intensive care unit bed, or who needs organ support and what organ support, but also in these, how do I really closely monitor my patients? There's a lot of openness, and that openness helps us a lot to get in front of people and position these innovations to them. Traditionally, diagnostics is, for good reason, very slow in innovation, but we see an enormous speeding up here to be open to look at things and give us a chance to make our case, and then go into an evaluation of those biomarkers in these specific use cases. So in that regard, I think for us, it can develop in a very good catalyst up to the point of emergency use authorization concepts, be it in the US, but also other geographies where those paradigms are considered. So to get new solutions in front of into the routine quickly to help the situation.
What does it mean also for regulatory pathways, especially in the US? Do you really see that you can bring biomarkers faster to the market?
We'll see. We give it a try because we believe that we can build a very specific COVID case. So obviously it has to be, if it's an emergency use authorization, it's restricted to COVID, and time-wise it's restricted to the market needing or the healthcare needs of these products in the context of COVID. So we have seen lots of emergency use authorizations, obviously for the viral tests, be it the PCR tests or antibody tests. But there is clearly, if you look at the position of the FDA, there is clearly an openness to also look into other aspects of the disease, and whatever helps will be reviewed under this emergency use authorization pathway by the FDA with highest priority, up to the point that at the moment any regular pre-submission is put on a back burner, and whatever may help in COVID will be prioritized, and even to the point that pre-submissions can turn into actual submissions without further if you have answered all the questions, will be turned right away into submissions and be evaluated immediately. So we have to see how these, let's say, more indirect tools that help management of the COVID-19 patients will resonate with the FDA. But we ourselves have initiated the process to explore that route. And I mean, obviously, it gets us our tests in front of users in a particular use cases and restricted to that use case. But certainly, it will help any further regular market introduction, be it in sepsis or acute heart failure, enormously if people are familiarized with these novel biomarkers in this COVID-19 context. So,
Martin, what is your view on that? Does that have an impact on also the strategy of a company like QIAGEN? How do you position yourself there? What are your
Well, I think COVID for us is an example that all the companies have to work on manufacturing capacities, right? This was one of the limitations in the last months. That's true not only for diagnostics, also for the vaccines. To us, this is a predicate example for the future. We very likely will see another epidemic coming up. Maybe it's a virus, maybe it's a bacteria. So I think what I'm saying is we need to be prepared. And this case here has allowed us to work on capacities and manufacturing. I think it has been also clear that there's a real need for a quick decision process in the hospitals. So, and I'm still fully agree with Rainer, right? So in the initial phase, it's basically volume-based, and that means this is a centralized lab, and you have also the economics behind it. But as soon as you pass the tip of the curve and the volume of the patients is going down, then point of care will come into play and will become even more important, maybe even in the physician office labs or physician offices itself. So what we see as a consequence is that we have to deal with both aspects, high volume manufacturing capacities, but also more rapid, accurate tests. And we need to be prepared for that. And the technologies need to allow such kind of diagnosis in short term, like Achim has now with SphingoTec. So the 15, 20 minutes is becoming more and more important. It's no longer acceptable that people are just waiting for days to come up with a result coming from their sample, right? So this will change.
Maybe one question. I mean, we have outlined some of the technologies which are emerging in the point of care, but given the high numbers of new cases and also the need of ensure an ongoing monitoring of the epidemiological situation in the population, what is the view of the panel or some technologies which are more typical of the centralized lab? So I'm alluding, for instance, on NGS. Any experience with that? We are aware it's not already on the market for COVID-19, but probably it's somehow emerging. Any of you has experience with that?
Maybe I can take that. So it is actually on the market. So there were co-developments together with Illumina. So for example, Medicover did that, a few others did that. You have tests that are available for COVID-19 confirmation, and those tests are being utilized. However, you can only utilize that at a certain amount of specimen to be analyzed at the same time. So we are looking here really at sample numbers, or 1,000 to 2,000 that you would put in one run and run together. The advantage with that approach is you can avoid the sample preparation. You would still have a turnaround time of minimum 24 hours. But your economy of scale is then actually way more attractive if you were to run that in that setting. So that is going to come, but it comes to at a price. I mean, if you were to fill basically the cartridge with that amount of samples, it is economic. But if you were below that level, it probably doesn't make sense, and then you would just link with the available technology that's there. I mean, let me make just briefly a comment on point of care. It does come with a price, and I mean, you basically price in the speed that you make available and the accuracy with that test. On the other hand, if you look at COVID-19, the situation right now, you see a bit of the opposite emerging as the prices are eroding, and quite significantly. I mean, reimbursement is coming down in all the countries. I mean, we see that. And you reach a point already by now that even with the conventional PCR testing, you reach a level where it's probably not any longer economic if you don't get to sufficient numbers of samples. So now bringing point of care test into this space, you would have to decrease quite significantly. I think that's the approach that you now see with the antigen tests, somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 euros, if I recall correctly. That's a completely different price game, and this is exactly where the US was hopping on when they were buying immediately from Abbott 150 million of those tests. And there is a somewhat a trend in the space to try to replace with antigen tests the existing PCR tests. But we all know, I mean, there is also a risk to it, because you catch the virus, basically 2 or 3 days later, and then you may have your spreaders walking around, and they may appear negative, but in fact they are not. So also keep that in mind. So with point of care, I think what Achim was pointing out, that makes a lot of sense to me in intensive care units, in dedicated areas, in cases where you really need to find one some fairly quickly. It does make sense. But this will always be the battle in a field where you have to request reimbursement in the area, and it's all about pricing at the very end. I mean, it's super competitive. Yeah? So you may have to find your niche for point of care in order to grow. Yeah?
Thinking about the future of point of care and the outlook, what is your expectation? Will it become more important, or will pricing pressure, further have a strong impact on growth? And maybe you have some ideas about the next big thing. I mean, what could really change this landscape? And thinking from the doctor's perspective, what would be a killer application for them that can then really stimulate a market so that, really point of care, even at a higher price, will be adopted widely.
And the way we look at this, for example, is not just to look at the price per test, but to look at the entire cost of running a sample, right? So that might differ quite significantly. If you look at a PCR point of care test price, but little training or less training required, no sample transport required because you can do it on the spot. Whereas sending a test to the lab has all these other costs to it. So it's not a clear one-to-one comparison of the cost in the lab is X dollar for a test or euros, and the cost at the point of care is different. So there will always be settings where a higher price per test is justified because the entire cost still is below sending a sample to a laboratory, right? So this is a setting-driven, sometimes geographically driven aspect of it. The next aspect we look at is the availability, right? Not all places in the world have the luxury to have access to lab equipment and have access to sufficient numbers of trained personnel, right? And if we look at also in this pandemic, again, what shows up, that is the great inequality, the huge inequality of access to healthcare in this world, right? That is one of the promises of point of care testing, to help overcome this inequality. And that goes back really to the fundamental values that each good point of care product should have, fast, easy to use, with little to no instrumentation. And that is a contribution that we at Healthineers believe we can make, and we're making, to making the world really a healthier place and a more livable place.
Christoph, you're making a great point because, if we look at the issue of COVID-19 with the perspective of the society, it is hitting very hard, not only in the US and in Europe, but even more so in some emerging markets. I'm alluding to Latin America, for instance. We are seeing India now ramping up very quickly. So what is your perspective, based on what you just said, of the development of those markets as opposed to the Western ones? Do you see them going more directly into the direction of point of care? What do you think the market will develop like?
So this is very, very different. Also, even within Latin America or within a country like India, as an example, right? There are places where point of care testing is really the only option. And antigen tests were mentioned. Antibody tests will definitely be needed and required very soon, right? So we see that trend for those countries. And in terms of the scale that we are building up in manufacturing for what we do, we are trying to respond to the tremendous price pressure that exists in these countries, right? So it's a key component of the way we are attempting to make a good contribution to fighting that disease and other diseases also, but now in particular with COVID-19, it has exposed the need for good, rapid diagnostics at a manageable price point.
Now, there is one area in diagnostics that, has always been, for a number of years, has been predicted to be a main driver of innovation and value. And that, doesn't need to really solve the problem of, do you really deliver actionable information to the clinician? And that is companion diagnostics. Potentially in companion diagnostics, because they help clinicians make the choice who of their patients should be treated by a potentially very expensive drug. The value of companion diagnostics might be very high and might be, more attractive than in other diagnostic fields where we are talking about rather standard tests. And do you have any ideas about that? And maybe, Achim, you could also give us a little bit of background on the use of your biomarkers as a companion diagnostic also?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Rainer. Good one. So SphingoTec is part of an ecosystem that shares the same founders and the same idea to kind of reduce mortality in critical care conditions. And one of our sister companies, Renate, has developed an antibody that actually targets one of our biomarkers, BioADM. That's a kind of an endothelial integrity marker, but at the same time a drug target. And that biomarker actually just yesterday, Renate released further data from their phase 2 clinical trial showing that it's very effective in lowering mortality in septic shock patients. If guided by actually two biomarkers, the BioADM, this endothelial function biomarker, and DPP3, which is a cardiac depressant factor. And and that is, Rainer, it's a very interesting point because, so far companion diagnostics were predominantly in the space of oncology, where turnaround time, for example, doesn't make a big difference, right? You can send in a sample, you can have even a whole genome sequencing on the tumor DNA and get some results back a week later. It will not change anything in the therapy of the patient. But if you look at applications like septic shock, turnaround time becomes incredibly important. So you need to make them the test, the companion diagnostic test for these indications available basically instantaneously. Otherwise, you miss your window of your treatment window. So in that regard, I think we will see more of these cases like the adrenomate example with adazizumab, where you simply by the sheer, if you want to use the drug effectively, you will need access to the test and ideally locally, instantaneously, so you can take the decision right away. I think beyond this really medical-driven need, it also has certain advantages. Now, from a pharma company's perspective, the one thing you don't want if you finally make it to the market after a successful phase 3, the one thing you don't want is that your biomarker test, your companion diagnostic test, becomes a limiting factor in the market penetration, right? And that is a bit of a challenge sometimes, because if you look at the central lab, you need to make sure that your companion diagnostic is available on all the large high throughput machines immediately, or at least, be it a Siemens machine, be it a Roche machine. And to cover the market and not get that as a limiting factor, you basically need to make sure that you work with companies like Siemens and to make those biomarkers available. And that happens, but certainly another way of looking at it be that a very simple and easy to deploy platform could take away that hurdle and give the pharma company control over the availability of the biomarkers, simply because they could co-market such a platform alongside the drug. These are concepts that we are actually actively exploring with pharmaceutical companies. So it has two sides to it: the medical need and the real-time availability of a companion diagnostic test result if you're in an acute care setting and critical care setting, but also the kind of commercial model behind it. How do I make my companion diagnostic available in an efficient way to not get in the way of the drug commercialization?
I think. Oh, please go ahead, Rainer.
Yeah, I think that was some very exciting thoughts about the world of companion diagnostics and how they could really then maybe hopefully in the not so distant future be used more widely, because the pharmaceutical industry over in the past has always tried to avoid companion diagnostics, and maybe that can even increase the part of the value chain that goes to the diagnostics industry. But let's see.
Just a brief comment? I know we run out of time, but just briefly. I mean, I'm in that space now over 20 years, and so a good example is Biomarkers, and I mean we also know that from the pharmaceutical industry, and it goes back to what Christoph said. Point of care with a single biomarker, for example, EGFR, KRAS, you can bring those devices into areas where labs usually don't run those super sophisticated platforms that require biomarker testing or companion diagnostics testing. So you can easily move, let's take this Biomarkers box, or you can also take the StatDX device from QIAGEN. You can now easily move that into areas where, let's say, a bigger diagnostic company may say, we don't want to make those services available in those countries. It's not lucrative for us because it's so small. You just move the point of care device there and you can make it available. So that's the big advantage, I think, for areas where it's difficult, where the lab infrastructure as such is not so well established. In smaller countries, you see that even in the southern part of Europe, Greece, Spain, we see that, where such devices gain momentum, because they can be utilized now suddenly in a small lab, can be put in a corner and can be run. So that's I think that's the attractiveness in that space.
I think we have time for just one last question, and I have a personal curiosity. I mean, we talked very much about some interesting use cases for point-of-care diagnostics in the context of COVID-19, but let's assume we get a vaccine at scale, no? And we briefly talked about the need to monitor immunity. How do you envision that to work? So if you have an opinion on that, how frequently are we going to get tested? Where do we get tested? Do you have a view on what it's going to be like?
We don't know, right? So actually, the natural immunity after infection with SARS-CoV is 3 months, 6 months, whatever, right? So if the vaccines are coming, it might be a bit longer, but I think it's a bit too early right now to make any assumption here. So I would assume in an ideal case, we are coming up with a vaccine that is similar to the flu vaccines, where you have to be vaccinated every year. That I would say would be already a positive outcome of the situation today. Probably we will have many different approaches in terms of vaccines. They will not be identical, and just remember that vaccines can make a big difference.
So also from our side here, a lot of options still. So we don't quite know, but so maybe a slightly different angle to this. from what we have seen in the past 6 months, 9 months, and the dynamic response of the healthcare industry to the challenge, I am very confident that whatever the testing need is, there are so many platforms, so many different tools out there that in the shortest time, we will be ready for it. And so I have a lot of confidence in the ability of the diagnostic industry to support the needs of vaccines once they are available and their mechanism and duration of immunization is known.
Well, very well. Thank you all. I think we are at time. I think it was a very interesting and rich discussion. So thanks a lot to the panelists from my side. Rainer, do you want to make some conclusion remarks?
Yeah, I think I've been on the diagnostics panel for many years, and I think maybe this is something that the COVID crisis really helped this industry to show that diagnostics are really a very important part of medicine, and diagnostics have gained a lot more importance and attention by the public these days. And there is no good treatment of a severe disease without diagnostics. And we also have experienced that there are new diseases, there are continuously new challenges that we need to address also with new ways, new biomarkers, new technologies. So that also personally makes me very opportunistic about that sector as a whole. And I think QIAGEN has also experienced that, over the last couple of months with the enormous interest that the stock has seen, but also many other companies. So I think we are in a very, very exciting area.
That's right.
So thank you very much to all the participants, and hope to see you soon again in person.